In this episode, I visit with Adrienne Bellehumeur about her new book, The 24-Hour Rule. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and I'm thrilled to have back with me Adrienne Bellehumeur, who has recently had a book published called The 24-Hour Rule. We had the chance to visit a little bit earlier this year, and she had told me about the book was near publication, but I asked her if after it was published, we could talk about it because we get to geek out on documentation. So, Adrienne, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me back. This is great.
So, first, let's start with the title, The 24-Hour Rule. I have to say that it sounds like something my mother would have impinged on me as a rule at the house, similar to the 3-second rule or other rules that I grew up with. So, where did you come up with this title?
The 24-hour rule is what I think is the golden rule of documentation. And it's very simple. It's that you need to reprocess, rewrite, or rethink information within 24 hours of hearing it, or in simpler terms, just do something with information. It is at the heart of so much lost information is when we go to meetings, go to conferences, meet new people, have a brilliant idea in the shower, and actually lose it within that 24-hour window. What I'm doing is really attaching the world of documentation to actually how we flow information and to the limitations of our short-term memory. So this is a very new take that you probably never heard in law school about documentation, but extremely powerful and has so many applications at work and for your personal life as well.
Well, when I went to law school, we had nothing to deal with the reality of practice of law at the time. It was all theoretical, very good education, but nothing to do with reality. So I think you answered this, but I'll ask it. Why did you write this book, and who is the audience?
So why I wrote this book, documentation is a massive underpinning practice in the corporate world for business owners, solopreneurs, but we have actually very few engaging resources to turn to when it comes to documentation. So I really saw this as a gap, as a yourself as a lawyer. I'm a chartered accountant, CPA. Big Four training. There is a lot of good training in documentation, but I sometimes think it misses the mark about actually training us collectively, not just in silos by our professions. Like lawyers are trained one way, CPAs another, engineers another way. IT, the list goes on and on. We have very siloed views of our currently training today's knowledge workforce. So I saw certainly a need for something more comprehensive, especially in today's work world where we are asked to communicate and speak in language that we all can understand. And also, let's face it, most documentation training out there is quite unengaging, can really put you to sleep. And I really saw a need to make this a more attractive, appealing way to get people at all levels to enjoy documentation, not just see it as like going to the dentist or doing something that your lawyers ask you to do or your auditors ask you to do. It's actually something that makes your business better. And I think part of that message is shifting how we train and engage people in the process. And so I answered part of your question, who I wrote it for. It certainly is applicable to today's knowledge workforce that is really wearing a lot of different hats. My main audience is sort of that manager, director level in companies that are really stuck with all the kind of the demands of the strategic demands and then executing on things. They're usually stuck with very specific problems, like they're tearing their hair out trying to get people to document, or they're taking a company public. They are trying to grow into a bigger business. All of these are actually just documentation problems. So the standpoint of the book is helping people who are struggling with documentation problems. And I believe it's actually a pretty pervasive set of skills that handles challenges everywhere from companies going public to compliance to just getting more effective pros. Like there really is very similar actually range of skills, and it's about solving those problems. So that's my primary audience. It's also great for business owners who are my business owner clients are very pragmatic, practical people. They don't want really corporate-y academic style of instruction. They're looking for something really lightweight for their organization. So I've certainly done well with them. And I guess the last audience, which is sort of, maybe not the primary audience, is just people entering the workforce and teaching what that world of documentation is, to make more sense of it, to make their careers better as well.
You use a phrase in the book I had not previously heard, which is dynamic documentation. What is that and what does it mean?
So dynamic documentation is like my brand of documentation. It's my philosophy of it as well. While documentation has traditionally been viewed as static, in my opinion, like contracts sitting over there, static metadata sitting in your database, so stacks of binders. When documentation is done properly, it's dynamic. It moves you into a forward state. If you've ever had the exacerbating experience of working on teams that never write things down, you know what I'm talking about. You will run in a circle and not forward. If you write call mom on your to-do list, you're doing it to make an action. So at the very principle of what I teach, and all documentation should drive back to actually pushing you personally or your organization or your team forward into a forward state to take forward action. So it's part of my brand, and also the underlying principle of why we document in the first place.
What are the 6 steps of dynamic documentation?
So that is how the book is structured. The 6 steps are a problem-solving technique. They're also intended to help build your skills. So number 1 is capturing, and capturing is it's not just about. We talk a lot about AI. AI is a very sexy topic right now, but I'm actually kind of old school in my teaching. A lot of capture is about information out of other people's heads, like information in meetings, interviewing people. Information from your own head actually needs to be captured as well, or it will get lost. Machine capture is part of it, but I have a lot of techniques there, including the 24-hour rule and note taking and interviewing, which is just about starting. If you want to start solving any problem, you need to get things on paper or out there so it can be worked on. Step 2 is structuring, which is actually the hardest step for me to teach others. And that's about doing stuff with information. And that can be anywhere from just creating documents, creating templates, creating databases, repositories. It's really making sense of what you have. Step 3 is presenting, which is where I give lots of tips about I call it dynamic writing and dynamic design. So making your documents engaging and appealing to your audience is a huge part of having successful documentation. Step 4, communicating, is making documentation a continual feedback loop where you're always getting input and getting feedback. Documentation is not something that is static. It's actually always moving. You don't need perfection to make it happen. So that's where really communicating comes in. Storing and leveraging is step 5, and that is more traditionally our information management practices. I work a lot in information management as well as compliance. That's a huge professional discipline. I actually think we give a lot of attention to storing and leveraging. That's where you find the most resources out there, and that's especially our talk of, ECM system, enterprise content systems, and all that discussion. But I actually only think it's one part of the bigger puzzle. And my last step I call leading and innovating, which is like your bonus step from doing all the other work in dynamic documentation. That's where you reap the benefits of all the work. And so I give tips around that. One of the biggest benefits of where you reap the biggest benefits is overcoming what I call groundhogs or groundhog day discussions, which is where you have the same conversation over and over and over again. And documentation is a big part of getting off those groundhog day discussions or groundhogs. Most organizations have groundhogs, and to really be a leader, you have to exterminate or at least tamely trap and release these groundhogs running around your organization so that you can move things forward. Other than the waste of information that comes from not processing it in 24 hours, the secondary biggest kind of time waste I see often with clients is groundhog day discussions where we're talking about the same thing over and over again. So that's where leading and innovating can really come in as well. It's kind of a new take on leadership and innovation.
So how can a company begin to utilize some of the strategies you've articulated in a business setting to not only record information, or as I would say, document it, but actually use it as a dynamic innovation tool that you would advocate?
So organizations, documentation is about, I actually believe it's a problem solving technique. I mean, even the 6 steps I talk about, there's a lot of ways companies can start. First of all, I would advocate starting with the problem at hand. I mean, you don't actually, the least successful documentation projects I have done are the ones where companies say, I just want to get documented, but they don't really have a point of what they're doing. Documentation, like almost all the projects I do, it has a very specific purpose, and that's okay to go in because companies are looking to leverage. They can't have everything in people's heads anymore. So really get specific on the problem you're trying to solve. That, and sometimes problems are obvious. Obviously, companies going public, or you're faced with regulatory or legal issues that are very obvious. I call them the big D, big corporate problems that you're faced. But there's also little d challenges you can identify. And little d is like your little everyday stuff. And that can be, you're noticing meetings are very ineffective, or you're having runaround discussions, or people don't know how to document. These are kind of those little everyday things that can be actually very equally as challenging as the big D, very obvious problems that you're faced with. And so my first advice is be specific on the problem you're trying to solve. The nice thing about documentation is it's a disarming or unobtrusive, unoffensive way of actually getting your team to work smarter. It's easier to get people to improve their documentation than say something like, we have a work ethic problem, or you're not as organized as you should be. It's a technique you can use to get people to effectively work harder on your team. So this is certainly part of my advice to overcoming these specific problems, is to use documentation as almost this tool or techniques to get people to work better and smarter through documentation. I certainly have lots of other tips in my book. My book is effectively a framework for better documentation, where companies can assess where they're at, look through what they have, I have standards I've developed as well. And these are all techniques you can use to help solve the underlying problem, but really starting with the problem at hand, assessing where you're at, and getting your team to work better through documentation are kind of my high level tips that'll take you pretty far on your journey as well.
Adrienne, in the compliance realm, at least in the United States, the Department of Justice has mandated that chief compliance officers have access to all data silos within a company. So literally, whether it's a CFO, internal audit, general counsel, HR, you name a corporate function, a CCO has to have access to that data. Is some of the strategies that you advocate, could it help a company with data governance or other problems they may have to actually access their own data?
So I am a huge believer of back to basics. So the challenge you're speaking of, I mean, it's certainly we have legislation now following it, but and all my clients, bigger and small, are faced with so many different repositories of information. We have so many tools that are popping up. So information is living in just many, many, many places. I don't think the challenge is that new. The basics of good information management policy is that you define your repositories, where things are supposed to go, and keep it there. If I consistently put my keys in the same spot at home, I will find them. If I'm a little lazy, which I am, and then you're running around the house looking for your keys before you go to work. It's not that different when it comes to information. And all companies, all of my clients, maybe some of your companies work with are perfect, struggle with this very basic idea of approved repositories. This thing should go here. And it's today's proliferation of tools and a lot of us living in chat right now. We're seeing all this information get wiped out of Teams chats. I mean, this is problem with all sizes of organization, and we almost have so many options for tools. It's getting worse. But it really goes back to that basics of approved repositories. And that's why it's probably there's people are getting really concerned about it, but where we're struggling is just good information management policy. So I do work in that area, but it's actually shocking sometimes how much we can miss some of these basic concepts, and then we're running around with more difficult information management governance problems as well.
You mentioned what I'm going to call ephemeral communications, meaning internal corporate, or not internal, but communications, which could be Slack, it could be Teams, it could be WhatsApp, it could be a variety of other communication tools where the information either can, on its own terms and its own time, be deleted, or it can be more easily deleted. Have you been asked to help companies formulate strategies to put that information in a document repository so it can be saved for later use?
I do this as part of my information management policy work. It isn't. I mean, information in chats. I don't personally. I'm not a big fan of information living. I mean, even email chats. You even think you go back to the 24-hour rule. A lot of these systems are well designed for almost 24-hour spurts of communication where information is very fresh in our brains. They're not particularly well designed for retrieval later. Not saying it's impossible. Of course, we have phenomenal tools on the market, by the way. There is not a challenge in the information management governance world with the tools available, because they really can find anything, and the technology gets better and better every year. But I'm repeating my point a little bit, apologize, but where we do struggle is just telling people where to put things and then having people follow through. So yes, the answer is yes, but it usually it goes back to just getting people to agree on where to put things. It's almost embarrassingly simple when it comes to my work. I mean, there is more complexity when you get down into the weeds, especially getting companies to have a simple and usable classification. And you don't want a lot of companies get really buried in so much detail when it comes to information management and governance, like almost overwhelms them. But this concept of Slack and email is more findable. In general, communication tools are great for communicating. They're great for and I actually love email. I think it's part of, I talked about in my book. But for being really findable for the future and something we can leverage for future value and find in legal, if we need to to want to support, assuming the information will serve in our favor. They are not the best to be there. So it is not advisable in general to leave important information locked in communications tools. Although the tools are very good to find things nowadays, but it's not the most efficient way of and not the most leverageable for future use.
Adrienne, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or your consulting practice. Where can they go? And then where can they go to purchase the book?
Well, the 24-hour rule and other secrets for smarter organizations is available every major retailer. It is distributed by Penguin Random House. You can find it on Penguin Random House site or Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can find it anywhere. So I would love if your listeners picked up a copy, and certainly ask me any questions you have about documentation or the 24-hour rule. My website is bellehumorco.com, which is my documentation business. And then my compliance business is riskoversight.ca. And I love connecting with people on LinkedIn as well, and please sign up for I have a newsletter on LinkedIn and one on I have one on Risk Oversight and bellehumorco.com as well.
Adrienne, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I greatly look forward to continuing our conversations.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom, for having me back.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. We've linked to Adrienne's book in the show notes, so I hope you'll check it out. I also hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever great podcasts are listened to. The award-winning FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.